All right, hi everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm just going to introduce our panelists. This is Diane Wu, is the Deputy Managing Editor at This American Life, where she's worked for the past 7 years. Also has worked at Gimlet's Science Versus, and before that, she was a scientist. And we used to work together, most important part. And Alex Goldmark is the executive producer of NPR's Planet Money, where he's been for the past 9 years. He's also, is this right, journalist in residence at Stanford? Is that?
There's a particular small slice of Stanford.
Stanford's Institute for Human-Centered AI, right?
Yeah.
I know you guys have a lot to talk about then. So thank you all for being here. We're gonna have a discussion up here for a little bit, and we'll open it up to questions, and then as you know, we'll do breakout sessions. One over here, and then we'll do a little circle over here, and you talk through ideas and things like that. You know, I started with like a very brief description of your bios, and I know there's like a million other things that you both have done, but I think it's more interesting to hear from you about telling us how you got to where you are, and I think I find that like when people talk about it, it's often a very zigzaggy line, and I love hearing about that. So what is your story of how you've gotten to where you are?
I haven't worked a million places. I think I've just worked at the show, but I came into radio super randomly. I was a scientist. I studied chemistry for grad school, but kind of just went to grad school because it was paid for and I wanted to live in California, and didn't know what I really wanted to do afterwards. So the whole time I was there, which was a while, I was in grad school for 6 years, was looking for what it was that I was actually going to do, because I knew chemistry was not my true calling, though I really enjoyed it. So I did a lot of experiments. Like I did a lot of science communication, which is a thing people do if you're a scientist who doesn't want to do science. But the thing that really clicked for me was joining a campus podcast. When I was in grad school about sustainability, that was super scrappy. I think there were like 3 or 4 students, mainly interviewing professors about their work in renewable energy. But we decided to make it into sort of a storytelling podcast, or tried to. And working on that, I just loved every step of it. I loved the craft of making radio a lot, and then almost quit grad school, decided to finish, and then applied for a bunch of internships afterwards. So I did an internship at Science Versus, which is one of the few shows that remains from Gimlet, and then applied for the fellowship at This American Life, and then clawed my way in, and that's where I've been ever since. So,
what about you, Alex?
I want to ask a follow-up question, but I'll give mine. But I'm going to put it on the table. How do you think that the precision and rigor required of doing science helps you be a better storyteller? And you can say it doesn't, and it's not worth talking.
I haven't thought of that, but the thing that feels like it translates the most is like you have to care so much about the thing you're doing and also be totally unattached if it doesn't work. Like there's so much failure in science. Like lab work is just failing and failing and failing, and my experience of making radio is also failing and failing and failing, and like putting your whole self into it, but then just moving right on to the next thing. If for whatever reason your story doesn't work, and a lot of our stories don't work. So.
All right, I'll have to keep fishing in my thesis of structure and rigor is what underlies heart and soul in storytelling, which is partly inspired by your colleague, physicist David Kestenbaum,
yeah.
And my former colleague. So I have the more windy path that can be summed up briefly as I started a long time ago when what was required was buying a mini disc player on eBay and getting a copied version of Cool Edit Pro 2, which is about 4 versions ago of audio editing software. And that moment allowed somebody who didn't know what they were doing to pitch stories to bigger places, and they had no real way of knowing you didn't know what you were doing. And so I did that, and I got onto Marketplace, which still exists as a radio show, I was in grad school at the time studying international economics, and so my pitches were at least smart about the subject matter, and so they would take them, I would do them, and they would go, "You are really bad at this." And then I would pitch it again, and they'd go, "This sounds interesting," and then a different editor would take it, and then they'd go, "You're really bad at this. Didn't you do one for us before?" And I had to say, well, it took you guys about like 45 tedious minutes of like redoing my work for 45 seconds of stuff. But eventually I bounced through doing those things while having a career in international development economics. I moved to Brazil. I became the only person in Brazil that it seemed like NPR knew that they could call that had a microphone. And so I got to file a couple stories, and they were like, "You're really bad at this. Didn't anybody ever teach you this?" And I was like, "No, nobody ever did teach me this." And eventually I got better, but I took a sequence of jobs, like being a board operator at WNYC here in New York, which meant that I did lots of listening to lots of radio, and just very few times I would go up and down on the dials and push a button. You have to be really good if something goes wrong, but if something goes right, and in a place like that it usually goes right, you don't have to do very much. And I slowly pitched stories on the side, and I got better and better. Until eventually I was regularly filing, I think, decent stories for Marketplace and places like that. And then I worked at a sequence of different radio jobs. Air America Radio, does anybody remember what that is? I was a call screener and a board up there, and then in the chaos that dysfunctional radio network was, I became an executive producer in like 2 years because everybody else quit. It didn't mean very much because they gave away titles because they didn't give away raises, but I got a lot of experience in a dysfunctional place practicing live radio, and then bounced back to public radio, and there it was more traditional path of producing at WNYC for about 6 years on different shows, and then switching to Planet Money about 9 years ago, where I worked with a lot of her former colleagues. My former colleagues, her current colleagues.
I've been doing several panels in the last week with editors at different publications and stuff, and like the first one I was, just chatting with the editors, and then I saw it was on Zoom, and somebody was like, "Are you going to ask about pitches?" And so I'm going to just sort of like pivot us because we don't have that much time, and we're just going to go like straight in. I think the thing that's very different is that audio works differently. The editorial process is very different than it is at different publications, and that's the thing. When I had moved from the Times to This American Life, like I talked to my old colleagues, and then I was like, yeah, they kill things if it doesn't work. And they're like, even if they worked on it for a really long time? And I was like, even if they've worked on it a really long time? And they just like couldn't believe it. And so I kind of want to like talk about the process by talking about pitches. So the first is, what are you looking for in a pitch or in a piece of audio journalism, but what are you looking for in a pitch? And then maybe we can sort of go with the pitch through the process after that. But whenever you're scanning through your emails, what are you looking for, and how does that change if the journalist is new to you?
Okay. What am I looking for in a pitch? A character undergoing an experience, and at the end they're different from when they started at the beginning. A lot of people pitch situations that are interesting, but you don't know who the character is. And for our show, there needs to be a twist. So there has to be someone has to act in a way that you don't expect them to, which is really hard to find sometimes. A lot of people are out there doing interesting things, but behaving exactly as you would expect at each step of the way. And we just really are looking for something that's surprising. Is the quickest way I would describe what I'm looking for. But something that I'm like, oh, that seems interesting, and there's a person in there. Or I can imagine the person I would want to talk to in that situation, if you haven't found the character yet. But yeah, that's what we're looking for.
And like when you're scanning through your emails, I mean, obviously you're looking, if you've worked with someone a bunch and you're like, oh, they've got great ideas.
Right, the second part of your question.
Yeah, if they're new to you, are you like, what are you looking for? It's the same thing, but.
Yeah. To me, it's kind of all the, like, I feel like I'm, like, if I've worked with someone before, I, like, understand, like, I know that it works or it doesn't work to work with them, but I feel pretty open to whoever I work with. I help run the fellowship program, so I, like, read a lot of fellow apps, and there's pitches in there, and if there's something interesting in there, I feel open to talking to the person. It's more just, like, if the person has a reason to pitch that particular story, that helps a lot too. We need, like, often when we're later on in the process of editing the story, we're like, wait, what's the mission of this story? Like, why are we telling this story now? And at our show, often the reason is the reporter has a specific personal reason that they're interested in this, or like a thing they're trying to figure out, and it helps to know that always helps. Sometimes that happens and they don't say it out loud in the story, but it helps to say it out loud in the story so you know as a listener why they're taking you on this journey. So if there's some element of that in the pitch, that can be useful. But I feel like if the person writes well, writing well is important, like writes well and like seems to have the pieces, I'll get on the phone with most anyone if I'm interested in the story. Often in the pitch meeting, someone will ask like, oh, what's their other work like? Do they, like, have they done features? Do they know how to find good characters? But I don't usually know the answer because I'm just interested in the story. But that's the kind of thing that other people on the show are interested in.
What about you, Alex?
For a Planet Money story, or specifically the Indicator, our shorter show, which is easier to pitch, especially if you don't have that much experience, it's 10 minutes or less out every day. We want every episode to have an insight into something that relates to economics or business, or how we work. We want the piece should explain a concept or an idea in business. So I think of that as something that's like permanent information, not just what just happened now, but like how something works. We would ideally love there to be a promise of some delight or some creativity or something unexpected in how you plan to tell it. You sort of don't need all of these things, but you need to have a lot of them. We would like it if you had a character and you knew what the character did and how they changed. If you don't, that's probably okay. Sometimes we can figure that out, but not always. And a lot of the times we get pitched, I guess in our version of getting pitched situations is we get pitched news. This thing happened and I want to cover it. And it's sort of like, okay. Or an interesting question, and we want to know is there also an interesting answer? Because sometimes very interesting questions have boring answers. Like, well, it's a lot of things and it's nuanced and there's 50 of them. And like, well, that won't be very interesting to listen to all 50 of them. Do you have a unifying framework or do you have an insight into how I should make sense of those 50? I don't mind the nuance, but you need to have a way to help me understand it. And so that's what I look for in a person that might be new is, do they have a plan of recognizing what might be their approach for more interesting, we keep saying interesting, and I feel like we should define what that word is more insightful or original or unique way to tell it, or a more structured way to outline it. And that might involve, you might signal that to me by saying, I would talk to a person like X, and I imagine they would say something like X, Y, and Z, right? And you don't literally need to know what they're going to say or what they're going to feel, but you can kind of guess that there is an economist out there who might have a certain kind of opinion on whether there are rolling recessions happening right now or not. And so just saying the word, I might go, I don't know what that is, let's try it. But you need to have a sense of how you would actually animate the piece step by step, especially if you're new. A lot of people do pitch the Indicator having already done a piece for their local member station, or I guess in your case for your classes, and you say, well, there was this other thing that I couldn't get to that I want to go into more, or there was this concept that I didn't get to explain because I was busy covering the news for my station. Would you be interested in that? And we are happy to take that too. And then we can listen to your piece, and if it's well written and moves along and has moments of delight and voice, that would help you.
I'm just going to pause here at the pitch for a little while because I think sometimes, when you're pitching a written story, some editors want it to be very short. They want it to be a paragraph. Some people want it, like the New Yorker, an editor from the New Yorker was here. He's like, I love a long pitch, like a couple pages long. And I was like, my head exploded because like everyone else is saying, no, we want it to be short. But it's very different for your stories. And so, what, like, are you opening an email and it's like you want it to be all sort of explain the steps, the beats of the story, like what it would be like for the audio, like how much explaining should you do initially? Or would you rather have it be a short pitch, then if you're interested, you'd want to know more, like how should they first email you?
No cliffhangers. I feel like that this is less from like reporters, but we have a story pitch where listeners or whoever wants to can write in, and they'll be like, "You'll never guess what happens next," and I'm like, "No, I really don't want to guess. Like, just tell me." But I think it depends. Like, some stories are things that have already happened. Like, we have two categories, probably more than this, but two kinds of stories where like the thing has already happened and someone can walk you through it, or like there's a thing that's going to happen that will be interesting to watch for this reason, and here's who I want to like watch go through it. I think for the kind of thing where the plot of it has already happened, it helps a lot to just walk through it. To me, I love pitching. We pitch stories to our own staff, and like it's one of my favorite steps of the process because you think through structure while you do it, and often the structure of the pitch ends up being the structure of the story. So if you have the whole story in your head, possibly, I do think it's useful to just kind of lay it out the way that you would if you were just telling it as a story. And the style of our show is often that is like the most chatty way. You say what happens, and then this, and then this, and then this, and whatever. So more is probably more. But for something that you don't know what's going to happen yet, but there's something you want to follow for this reason, and here's why it's interesting, that I would say those things in the pitch.
I don't know how people have time to read super long pitches, so short, please. But that said, I've seen great pitches that are short and great pitches that are long. The more important thing is, do you actually know what our show is? Can you say why this would fit in our show? And you only need a line or two to do that, right? I don't need you to say the outline in it right away. I'd rather actually you tell me what the insight that you expect us to take away from it is. Like a question I have found myself asking as a follow-up often is like, imagine the audience, and what do you assume they believe at the beginning of the story, and how will it be different by the end of the story, right? So like you're moving us forward in our understanding of the world, so convey what that is. It also helps me figure out what you assume about our audience. Is it a high level of knowledge about economics for the subject, or low level? And I might disagree with you there, but at least I'll understand what you're aiming at, and we can tune that. And then if I ask a follow-up question, do not be surprised, or be ready to answer if I were to push play when your story runs. What would come first, second, and third? It's just like give me, you should have some sense of what your structure would be and what I would hear, right? Would it be a scene, like an event that you're going to go to and you're going to watch in real time, or is it somebody talking? Are they talking in an intimate way in their bedroom to a friend, or is it to you? Is it voices, disembodied voices from a stage? Just you don't need to put all of that in there right away. But if we end up talking and then you can't answer that, you either haven't done this enough to work with us efficiently, or you haven't thought about the story enough to be ready to do it.
Are you expecting that they've already gathered tape, some tape at least?
No.
Yeah, not necessarily. The stories that we greenlight, we assign a producer to, and like work super closely with the person and have a specific. So often it's actually easier to have not gotten tape, but it helps to know who you're. There's so many different kinds of stories, so I don't want to like generalize too much, but it helps to know who you think you're going to talk to. Tell us if you've talked to them, how open they are, like what kind of talker are they? Are they like, and that stuff. But I don't think necessarily we need tape. Although sometimes it's really cool if you have cool tape, so don't not pitch us that either. There's such a variety of stories, so I feel like there's not real rules on that side.
So you say you have a pitch that you do want to like move forward. I mean, that was like that when I worked at This American Life, I was like, oh my, I couldn't. The Google Docs and the meetings and stuff. Like, so you have a pitch that you like it, and then you get on the phone. Diane, you said you get on the phone with the journalists and talk to them about it, and then what happens? The process is usually someone writes in. If I'm interested, I'll call them, fill in the questions, then I'll pitch it to our staff, and then they'll say, heard this before or whatever, or they'll say, yes, go make this, and then we assign a producer on staff to the reporter, to the contributor, who then
basically co-reports the story, so works with them to be like, okay, here's who we're going to do interviews with. Let's book these. We do an interview prep together, so all the questions sit in on the interviews with whoever the reporter is. So maybe we'll go to the field to go talk to them there, or like sit in the studio. Make sure that all the story, that we're getting the tape that we need for the story, and then after we've collected all of that, the staff producer. Is this the answer that's interesting to you guys?
Yeah, all the answers are interesting, so keep going.
The staff producer then, unless we're working with like a really experienced radio producer, the staff producer then pulls the quotes. So they listen back through and choose what moments of tape are most interesting, in consultation with the reporter who is also there. Like usually right after an interview, I'll be like, what were your favorite moments? And we'll jot those down, and then pull tape based on that plus other stuff. Then we bring in our editor, who also sometimes will help out for the question prep part, and play the tape for them. And usually this is sort of as the structure coming together, so we'll play the tape in roughly a structure, so there'll be like bullet points that get you from piece of tape to piece of tape. At this point, often we'll be like, oh, we didn't get reflection on when his mom left or whatever, and have to go back to the interviewee. And then if it's working, and often it isn't at this point, if it's working, the next step is to start writing a draft. So the reporter will fill in the gaps between the tape, usually is how I think of writing at our show. And then we do a pretty extensive edit process, which are these live table reads with like 4 or 5 producers on staff and editors, and you like read your script and play the tape live, and then everyone takes notes furiously and gives their thoughts at the end, and then we all sit in a room and rewrite it together. So it's very collaborative, and there's usually like 2 to 4 edits on any story that makes it on the show.
The furious writing was the part that no one told me about before the first edit. I sat in, I was like, what is happening? And everyone's like writing very quickly.
Yeah, you're basically live logging the story, is how a lot of people do it, which is a weird thing to watch.
Yeah. What about you, Alex?
On the Indicator, we have a much more streamlined process because we come out 5 times a week. So if you have a pitch, you would get a call back from probably Kate Kincannon, who edits that show. And she and you would go over what is your angle, what is your insight, or maybe you would talk first, and then she would pitch it to the team. We'd find follow-up questions. What about this? What about that? It would actually be more interesting in this direction, or, oh, remember we covered this before, so let's do it slightly differently this time, which is a problem on the Indicator when you do things 200 times a year. And so then after it's been greenlit, you would get, you'd go through a conversation with Kate or me or whoever's editing that one, but probably Kate, and you'd pick out what is the tape going to be, what should it roughly be, kind of get a structure. If you already have the tape, you might say, this is what I have, and I can't go back and get more tape for all kinds of reasons, and then we go, fine, we'll work with what we have. That usually leads to an outline. You go off and you write it on your own. You come back to a group edit, and that usually has 4 or 5 people on the team. We are all remote, so instead of, some people will be live logging like that. Other people will just mark up a Google Doc with notes, which can be distracting also and weird to watch. And then we talk about it, and we try to keep it short, those edits, to like half an hour of conversation, because they can go on to infinity. And then at the end, there's sort of like some follow-up questions from the editor or the reporter. What did you mean by that? What should I change? These 2 things are in conflict. How do I square them? And we try to problem solve or come up with more creative fixes. And then the editor and the reporter on their own synthesize them, and they do that rewriting together in the final stage. Then because we co-host everything, there's a sort of second edit happening when we do the co-hosting, in that you are now co-hosting it, and if a thing doesn't sound right, a producer listening might go, please take that again, or why don't we try it slightly differently? And that's sort of line fixes of how they come out in the booth. We get a final draft, we fact check that, Sometimes we might fix things there, but usually we try to not do what we call vanity edits at that point. Like, I didn't sound good, or it wasn't just right. We really believe that, like, we want to grade ourselves on the average of how good we are over the course of 200 plus a year, rather than is each one as good as it can be, because then you get obsessive with one at the expense of the next show. Then we do a final mix, listen, check, and ship it out. So the whole process can take 3 days, or it can take weeks, depending on what the reporting is involved in. If that first edit isn't good, we might say do another draft and do a second edit and then shelve the piece. That doesn't happen that often, but it's more likely to happen with a first timer. On Planet Money, it's basically like that process, much more. And I think we go through 2 or 3 edits, per piece, same thing.
So I'm going to open it up to questions. I have one more question, but it's our, I don't mean to like rush us through, but so we can get to our breakout sessions too. Do we have a microphone for questions? Okay. I'll ask a question so you guys can get ready for your questions. So the theme, with This American Life, there are themes that you're looking for stories for. So what are you looking for particular topics now? Or are there stories that you're like, no one ever pitches us something on, I don't know what, dance or something? Or you things that you're like, I wish we had more sports stories, or whatever it may be. And I think I know the answer for you, but I don't. So what are some of the themes you're looking for? And then, Alex, are there things that you're like, I wish people would? This is a hole that needs to be filled, and no one ever pitches us these kind of pieces. We'll go with you, Alex, if that's for.
No, not specifically. I would actually say whatever you are not hearing on the show that you think we should be covering more is probably a good whole, right? Because what we don't know, what we're missing, that's what we want by definition. You still have to tie it back to an economic concept or principle, and does it have an insight, and so forth. But like the pitches we love the most are like, here's a thing happening in a corner of the world or a corner of America that you didn't even know about that has this interesting character, and they're facing a dilemma that reveals this big economic concept. And we're like, great, all of that is new to me and I want it. But I wouldn't know how to assign that without hearing about it first.
When you said sports stories, we never ever do sports stories, and I think they can be so good, but all of it, like so many of my coworkers are like theater kids and just like don't have that, like so many, just don't have that interest. Someone pitched, what was it? Like a pool story? Oh, it was a bowling story recently that we didn't greenlight, but I was just like reading the pitch, I was like, wow, sports are so compelling. I think it's often hard to get athletes to talk about what they're doing in an interesting way, but I think they're out there, so I would like to do more sports stories. I'm trying to think of upcoming themes. We talked about doing a heist show today. We had our story meeting today, which sounded fun, or like a heist / buddy comedy show that explores like the different elements of the tropes of a heist movie. We're thinking about how to cover the election, thinking about doing maybe a swing state show in some way. I don't know what that means yet. We're still figuring that out. But yeah, I think a lot of stuff right now feels pretty newsy, but we're also trying to do more fun stories too, because I think the show has tilted pretty heavily news in the last many years. Trying to think if we're not looking for pitches on this now. I wish I had it off the top of my head, but a show I'm excited about is like a lists show that started off with a pretty newsy, bleak story about a Russian list of foreign agents that people would check every day to see if they were on, but expanded out to like a lot of other fun stories about lists. Trying to think what other themes. And the problem is our show like has like a 2-month cliff, and I like don't know what happens after 2 months. So I don't know. 2 months is as far out as we typically have our theme set. So another fun one was about self-loathing. Was another one we've been talking about, kicking around the self-loathing heists. And do the themes come from a story idea that comes in that we're like maybe
that you're like the story could fit in a theme like this, or is it just like, let's do a buddy cop theme? It's sort of both, right?
Yeah,
how do the themes come about?
Yeah, sometimes it's just like, usually it's based on some story. So other ones that came out of today's story meeting, I'm remembering slowly, are like exception to the rule, or like surely it wasn't about me, which the idea for that one came from like an immigration story about someone who thought that, like, I'm gonna summarize this badly, but that like things would be fine for them, and then they weren't. Another theme, but yeah, usually we always ask at every step is like, why this story now? And some stories that we do don't really have a reason to exist except for that they're like fit a theme nicely, and it's like pleasurable to hear it. So sometimes coming up with a theme for an interesting story that doesn't seem to otherwise have a reason helps.
Questions from the audience? Raise your hand, and we have a microphone here.
Hi, my name is Elle. I was wondering what percentage of pitches that you guys respond to get killed in the reporting process?
The ones that we greenlight,
Yeah.
I think it's at least half is what it feels like. I don't think we actually keep numbers, but it's very common. Often it'll be like, oh, the beats of the story are slightly different than pitched, or like this person won't talk, or like this person doesn't want us to call their mom for fact checking. This is the reason why I had to kill a story recently. So, a lot. I can give you a lot of reasons, but that wasn't your question.
Once we greenlight something, we very rarely kill it.
Thank you.
We have a question up here.
But you should ask for a kill fee. Do you pay a kill fee?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. I'm wondering, so you've spoken about like potentially including some tape, or just or maybe the advantage of not including tape. I'm wondering when it comes to, I'm assuming a lot of us have like made things for a class, and we have like a draft. Would it be helpful to have access to that draft, like with the pitch, or would it be helpful to like just say that we have a draft that we can provide, or should we kind of just be like, this is the story, and kind of start from scratch with whoever like we work with?
I think just saying that there's a draft is good. I think just because reading is faster than listening usually. I don't know. All of us work so differently, but I think of me and my coworkers. But I think, yeah, say there's a draft, and then if people are interested, they can ask to listen. Or sometimes we'll just be like, hey, can you like send us a little bit of the main character talking, just to get a sense of what they're like. So yeah.
Yeah, linking to whatever you have is helpful. We can always just not look at it.
So for someone you've never heard from before who might not have a ton of audio clips or has no audio clips, would you like a portfolio included? Would that be helpful or not?
Maybe anything that shows me you understand what the point of the episode will be, and you will make choices that will serve that point. So probably a well-crafted email will do more than me looking at past work at data visualization or something. But if you are pitching a thing about the auto industry and you tell me you worked at a car dealership, I want to know that.
I think if it's like a beat that you've been exploring even in other mediums, like that's helpful to know, like to see that, oh, like maybe they haven't done a radio story about this before, but they've like done these other things and like seem like they're well sourced or whatever. We work with a ton of print reporters who've never done audio before, so audio experience specifically is less important than like having a really good story.
Hi, thank you guys for being here. For Planet Money, I'm curious, I can imagine that there are like different kinds of stories that you get, that there are some that are very clearly economic stories, and it's like told by an economist, or like here's some big new idea, or maybe it's something about a market in some kind of, particular country. But some of the stories that are particularly fun are more like, a little corner in the world, and then here's like this takeaway that's like an economics insight. How do you tend to bring in that economic insight out of this like little niche thing? Because is it a little bit of a strange, I'm just thinking about like if I were to develop my own story, like is it weird to have this little story and then like, and now here's an economist voice who like tells you what it means? Just like how do you tend to jump from like, here's a fun niche story, now here's a big idea, and how do you tend, like is there a particular pattern that you find yourself following in those kinds of stories to make the leap into an insight?
You can go in either direction, and it's the hardest thing,
Yeah.
is to pair a explanation of a complicated economic concept that is also ideally important, have an insight on it that is non-obvious, that just happens to neatly be illustrated by a character with feelings and reflection, is just really, really hard. So some people find the story first, and then they cast about for what does this say about economics. That has tended to lead to, I think, some of the fewer times when we've killed the show, when we're like, well, that was amazing that this person had like a wild, shaggy dog tale about their fight against their homeowners association and their neighbor, and then they fell in love, but like it doesn't illustrate anything bigger, and we can't take it, but it was a fun talk. If you have a really insightful economic concept about something that's big that's happening, we have a little more safety because for our show, we don't have the burden that they do. We can just then make a very clear step-by-step explanation of it, and it's still valuable. The people who tend to have the most stories and the most pitches on our team, like in the queue, are the ones who have the most subject matter expertise. It doesn't mean that they are ready to go with them, because they still need to find their characters or their way of doing it, but they're like, I can't wait to do a story about this, I can't wait to do a story about that. And so it makes their sort of casting about for their next story is a little bit shorter and a little bit faster. So subject matter expertise is really helpful. And you can be expert in like lots of things. It doesn't have to be economics. It could be an industry, or it could be a different academic discipline, or it could be a place that has interesting economic like forces at play, and then you can probably get somewhere faster because you get to specifics. And I might regret saying this, but sometimes if you have your story written enough that you can explain it well, this is the one useful thing of the new ChatGPTs and AI stuff, is you tell it to that, and then you say, what are the economic concepts that are at play here? And it will be wrong with like 70% of the answers, but it will give you 3 that you've never heard of, and then you can go and research. And if you don't know economics at all, you'll have to go research 10, and it might be a waste of time. But we have had moments when we were like, I have 2 examples of X, but I don't know of 3, and the third, and then you get a list, and then you go and report it out. Or I have a story where a person gets in a fight over a such and such, what are the economic concepts behind that? And I like forgot so many concepts from grad school that like I don't remember them. And then I'll see the name again. I'll be like, oh, that's the one I need to go and Google again. Like a reverse Google for the terms. And that may help you depending on your existing knowledge level. Just don't trust it to put in a pitch, because that will be very embarrassing when it's wrong.
Don't rely on it.
Hi, I'm Aria. Thanks for being here. I'm curious if you typically look for a news peg in the story or in the pitch, and then when a pitch does have a news peg, does that kind of get prioritized over pitches that might not have a news peg? Because I've, had advice before that, oh, you should have a news peg in your story whenever you pitch. Is that the case for your shows?
We like news adjacent. Like, we don't want to be the news, but we want to explain something that the news brings up. So if something is in the news confusing everyone, then we want to explain that thing. Or the term that gets said a lot in the news, but not explained, that is where we live.
Sometimes, like, we do a mix of newsy things and like personal stories and comedy and whatever that's evergreen. So if that is the most exciting thing about this story, it helps answer why this story now. But if there's another answer to that question, then there doesn't need to be a news peg. And then if the thing, like, if it's something that's like happening, right, like, today in our story meeting, we talked about protests on campus and like how to cover that at our pace, which is like we're a weekly show. Like we're not gonna do something that's breaking, but we want to have like a slightly deeper story than all the breaking news. So pitching something that has a news peg but isn't breaking news, I think, is appropriate for our show.
So that's a good example, right? Like, we are going to do a story on divestiture tomorrow, or, I forget whether it's going to run tomorrow or Friday. And like, I was looking around, I was like, I keep hearing Columbia, I keep hearing divest. I don't see anybody saying, what are they actually invested in, right? I don't see anybody naming who is in charge of making that decision. I don't know what mechanisms a review board would happen for actually divesting. I don't even see people mentioning the size of that endowment, which is huge, by the way, and therefore is a substantial request and claim. It's all about who locked themselves in what building and what lawn they're allowed to be on, which is truly the human news of today, so understandable. But if someone were going to pitch us an economic story about divestiture, I would love it if they came in and they were like, hey, look, I figured out this is every one of the stocks that is related to Israel, or if the campus had a list, the campus protesters had a list, and this person had an insight into that. Turns out they're all weapons related, or they're all food related, right? Or some kind of insight related to the news that is not the news, right? This is not the first time campus protests have called for divestiture. It's happened many, many times over many, many issues. Find me a person who did it before, who used to run the Columbia Endowment or the Yale Endowment or whatever endowment, divested from fossil fuels or something else, or apartheid if they're still around, and tell me an insight about that. It was really hard because this, or it was really easy once they figured out this thing, right? That's the insight I want, not just that it happened, and not just that list, because I can get that list, right? Or I can get it as easily as anybody else. But if you have an original thought on it, I'm going to be like, well, we should pay this person for that original thought that I am jealous that I didn't have.
And how, anyone raise your hand? I'll ask a quick question. How much in advance are you planning Planet Money and also The Indicator?
We are planned usually about 2 months out also. The Indicator is about 2.5 weeks out. But if you gave us a thing that was super newsy, we could turn it around 3 days. We could do The Indicator in 1 if we needed to. We don't like to do that, but we could. Yeah.
Hi. Could each of you talk a little bit about your own process for looking for stories? Because I know both of you do. Well, I don't know if you're purely editorial role now, Alex, but you used to do a lot of stories. Anyway, so if you could just talk a little bit about how you go about looking for stories, I think that would be helpful.
It's so hard. I wish I had. I'm doing it right now. Many different ways. I think reading things and paying attention to what other questions I have, or just what one detail am I drawn to. Always, basically every time I'm moving through the world, I'm wondering if there's a story. So just always being awake to oh, is that the thing? Doing a lot of reading and being what questions, or if you feel like the article ends but you still want to know more about one person in it, call that person. Talking to people, I think, just getting on the phone and not even knowing exactly what the story is, but wanting to learn more about a topic. Right now, one thing that I'm looking, I feel so naked telling you guys my process because we've been talking about birth control at the show, and I'm interested in talking to people who are educators in alternative birth control about what they've noticed and just patterns that they've noticed. This is a really long shot way of looking for a story. A lot of people read local, on the show, look at local news in other places. A lot of reading. Also, once you start reporting on a thing, you can kind of you're talking about with just having a lot of, I don't remember what you called it before, knowing a lot about a subject.
Subject matter expertise.
Subject matter expert.
It's not a catchy name.
Sometimes when you get rolling on a topic or a beat, I guess I'm just explaining what a beat is, but talking, reporting out one story can lead you to a bunch of other people and like little stories that you want to follow up on. I did a story last fall about a migrant looking for work in New York and was following up, and now it's like 6 months later, I'm curious how they've survived. So just following up with people from previous stories. It's really hard though. It's like the hardest part.
I would say, so I haven't done anything myself, maybe like one or two since the pandemic hit, and I switched to like really having to mostly just manage schedules and give feedback on stories. But the general approach on the team or that I have also done is try to read the most original things, right? If you're just reading the New York Times and New York Magazine, everybody else on your staff also has, so you probably won't have an original idea that they haven't already had. So go somewhere else, local news, or get to your like niche blogs. For us, since we're in the like academic world, like find your favorite academic who blogs, even if they only blog once every month, and set your Google alert for like when that publishes. Nick Fountain on our team has 1 million Google alerts for like his little obsessions, and they're like, I don't know, like one of them is something related to like carpentry loans or something. Like I don't even understand it, but he like sets those up for like, okay, like this sub-world is going to pop off about this eventually. I want to like be there when the like microblogs start mentioning it, and then he's ready for it. And that's just you slowly accrue it. I have found that I am more satisfied with my ideas when I read less ephemeral news, less stuff that happened right today that is like obsolete by the next day, and I switch to more books or I switch to more long form things, because then I draw more of my own connections. This is like that thing over there, and then that's my original idea that I might pitch. And so that's sort of how I would do it. And I think when I was doing a lot more stories, I found publications that I really enjoyed that had like, you know, a front of book that they just mentioned weird thing happening, and I would like look those up more. It would be the like small mentions, and then I would chase them down.
I think we're about ready for our breakout sessions. Anyone have one last question? Okay.
So Whitney already asked about this, but I'm going to ask it in a different way, which is to revisit the topic of the theme on This American Life. I'm just curious how much the theme shapes the kind of pitches that you're looking at, or whether it shapes the pitches you're looking at. And for example, if you get a good story idea, but you don't have an upcoming theme that matches that idea, you know, would you reject it, table it, still follow up with the journalist who's proposing that story? I'm just curious to hear a bit more about how that plays into the process of selecting stories.
Totally. Yeah, the theme is very loose. Like we use it as a tool to like help stories go more than as like a weeding out of stories thing. We're always looking for stories. Usually the themes come out of the story. So like if we get a great pitch, that feels like it could be what we call an anchor, which is just like the meat of the show, maybe 20 minutes. Then we'll like figure out what themes are in the story and make a show for that. So, but I also think it can be, since our show is literally stories about anything, the theme can be helpful as like a focusing tool to be like, oh, what do lists make me think of? What's a list that I've interacted with, or what's a list I wonder about? Or like you start to notice that in the world more. So it's more, yeah, it's hopefully like a helpful thing and not we don't exclude things because they don't fit any upcoming themes, for sure. But also it does help, it can be a helpful exercise when you're pitching to be like, this could be in a theme about whatever, if it's like an exciting theme, or like if it gets at a bigger idea that you think is out, like, you know, in the zeitgeist, like this feeling that you have, or whatever the words are for the theme that the story illustrates. That can be helpful as a way for us to think about the pitch too.
Great. Thank you so much. And so we'll do two breakout sessions. One will be around the table there, and then if students would help, we'll do a little circle here.